Okay, we'll start. Hi, I'm Liz Boyles. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Election Innovation and Research media briefing on the expected election report from Cyber Ninjas in Maricopa County, Arizona. As a reminder, this event is open to media only, and all speakers and remarks are on the record. The use of video, audio, and stills must be approved before use. To request the use of these, just email me, Liz Boyles, at liz@brassrc.com. First, you're going to hear from our speakers today, and then we will open up the Q&A portion after brief introductory remarks from each speaker. To ask a question, you can do so at any time. You can just type it into the Q&A box, which is separate from the chat. If you have any issues with the Q&A box, you can email any questions to me and I can help troubleshoot. Please just identify yourself and your outlet before you ask your question. If you have any questions that are unrelated to Q&A about the technology, please just ask us in the chat. Today, you will hear from the following experts: David Becker, who is Executive Director and Founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research; Stephen Richer from the Maricopa County Recorder; Ray Valenzuela, the Maricopa County Director of Elections; Benny White, a data analyst for Pima County Republican Party and the Arizona Republican Party, also a member of the Pima County Election Integrity Commission, representing Pima County Administrator and Republican candidate for Pima County Recorder in 2020. Jennifer Morrell, a partner at the Elections Group; Matt Masterson, a non-resident fellow at Stanford Internet Observatory, formerly election lead for CISA DHS; Ben Ginsburg, a Republican election law attorney who will be available to answer questions only and will not be giving introductory remarks. Thanks again for joining us, and here's David Becker.
Thanks, Liz, and thank you all for joining us today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is David Becker. I am the Executive Director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research in Washington, D.C. We work with election officials around the country of both parties to ensure that elections have security, integrity, and are accessible to all. I've been working in elections for almost a quarter of a century now. I've been a trial attorney with the Justice Department's voting section for many years under two different presidential administrations, the Clinton and W. Bush administrations. And then for many years, I ran the Pew elections program until founding CEIR in 2016. I think most of us are aware that we're now hearing that the Cyber Ninjas are ready to deliver their report to the Arizona Senate, probably early next week. Now, that is about 10 months after the election and after many delays and missteps in the process. So I think it's important that we collected this great group of experts to kind of put all of this into context as we consider what this report, whatever it says, might mean. First, I think it's really important to talk about what we know about the 2020 election. We know as an objective fact that the 2020 election was the most secure, transparent, and verified election in American history. How do we know that? Well, first of all, we had more paper ballots voted by voters than ever before in American history. About 95% of all ballots cast in the United States in 2020 were verifiable paper ballots. That is a significant increase on 2016, when we only had about 75 to 80% of all ballots cast on paper. And that included states like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, all of which moved entirely to paper and were not entirely in paper in 2016. Important to note that Arizona has been all paper for many, many years. Their election laws have been in place for many years, and Arizona's election in 2020 was not that dissimilar to previous elections because of the foresight of Arizona legislators and election officials in setting up the Arizona balloting system. I also want to add that we saw more audits of those paper ballots than ever before. We saw audits done in Georgia where they literally counted every single presidential paper ballot by hand and then 2 additional machine counts. We saw more audits done in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, many other places. And of course, that includes Arizona, where there were audits done consistent with the Arizona laws that were on the books. We saw more pre-election litigation in this election cycle that clarified the rules. When campaigns or other individuals didn't like the rules, they went to court and they sought to get some kind of clarification on those. Both sides won some of those and both sides lost some of them, but they had an opportunity pre-election to litigate that out and get those rules clarified before the election. And of course, we saw more post-election litigation than ever before by far. And it was overwhelmingly, almost unanimously won by the election officials who were able to verify that the outcome of the election as reported was correct. Nevertheless, we're seeing a losing candidate in the presidential race, and this ecosystem of grifters that have surrounded him continue to lie to his supporters who are sincerely disappointed in the outcome, probably in an effort at grift, at engaging in the long con and to get money out of this problem. And this is going on to this day. We know it's likely they know that the outcome was correct. They could have requested, the Trump campaign could have requested recounts, for instance, statewide in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. They chose not to do so. That's a very important point. They could have gotten statewide hand recounts of all the ballots in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and all they requested was recounts in 2 counties in Wisconsin, neither of which used Dominion voting systems, by the way. All of this, of course, has led to a denial of the election, but also threats against election officials that are ongoing to this day. We just were at the National Association of Secretaries of State meeting in Iowa this week, where several secretaries reported they are still seeing death threats and other threats to themselves and others, sometimes to their families, to this day. And it also led to the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol. And I think most of you have heard right now, there is an ongoing incident near the Capitol, where there's a bomb threat right now with someone live streaming that this is part of the quote revolution. So these are the dangers that we're seeing in the continued election denial, and they're happening even as we speak right now. Now in Arizona specifically, the state and counties audited the results of the election. They did so under Arizona law that had been passed by Republican legislatures, that had been signed by Republican governors, and had been mostly enforced by Republican election officials through the state. The audit was done extremely well. It verified the results. And then Maricopa County, not satisfied with that, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Reporter Richer on this, went above and beyond that and instituted a secondary audit of the technology in February that further confirmed the technology operated as it was intended. And that audit was conducted by certified labs, 2 different certified labs that have experience in this area. Nevertheless, the Arizona Senate pursued this highly partisan effort. They hired the cyber ninjas. They have 0 experience with anything related to elections. They're an out-of-state firm, and they accepted what they knew was going to be a fraction of the cost of this review because they knew they'd be able to raise millions of additional dollars in this continued misinformation campaign directed at the sincerely disappointed supporters of the former president. Cyber Ninjas has repeatedly demonstrated its bias and incompetence. It's destroyed the chain of custody of both election records and technology. It's hid its funding and documents from public disclosure in violation of federal and state law. And it's failed to understand basic principles of election administration and data. For instance, one of the things we know, there's a report put out by States United, written by former Kentucky Secretary of State Trey Grayson, a Republican and a professor of political science, Barry Burton at the University of Wisconsin, that laid this out. There, in addition, is a very recent task force set of recommendations that was put out by the National Association of Secretaries of State, just released this week after their meeting, where a bipartisan group, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, came up with a set of recommendations to verify the vote, to conduct effective audits. Those sets of recommendations were passed by the bipartisan membership of the National Association of Secretaries of State, and they include recommendations such as do the audit very close to an election in time, maintain the chain of custody of those ballots, do not allow third parties to destroy that chain of custody of ballots or technology, which could lead to insecurity in the systems, that the process must be overseen by the professionals, by the election officials, like people you're going to hear from today, like people like Ray Valenzuela, who have the most knowledge about these systems, that the system must be transparent to all. Whereas we know here in Arizona, the reporters were often kept out of the ongoing so-called audit. the liaison from the Senate themselves was on at least 2 occasions kept out of the site where processes were ongoing. And then the cyber ninjas also opposed release of basic documentation. There's some ongoing litigation going on in the state of Arizona, and there's also subpoenas from the United States House of Representatives that have not been responded to yet, where they have not provided those kinds of documents yet. And then finally, they recommended that only accredited labs do this kind of work. Cyber Ninjas has no accreditation in this area, whereas the labs employed by Maricopa County to confirm the results are both accredited federally. So this has been a half-baked effort by a firm that's completely unequipped to have anything to do with election work. And the result of this effort was fully baked from the beginning. The ninjas are likely going to intentionally cast doubt on the outcome, even though it's been verified and confirmed more than any election in Arizona history. And that perhaps is an attempt to continue the grift over time. And sadly, there are legislators in other states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and others, that are seeing similar embarrassing efforts to damage the confidence of American voters. But fortunately, there are many principled Arizonans and experts who've been working to counter the disinformation that's coming and to inform voters about the confidence they should have in the 2020 elections and elections going forward. And we have a lot of them here today to talk, and I'm going to hand it over to them now. I'm just going to briefly introduce them all, and then I'm going to hand it over and we'll go through them. First, we're very fortunate to have Maricopa County Recorder Stephen Richer and Maricopa County Director of Elections Ray Valenzuela. After that, we're going to hear from Benny White, who's a longtime fixture in Arizona Republican politics and was the candidate for Pima County Recorder in 2020 and lost that election. Then we're going to hear from Jennifer Morell, an experienced election official who knows more about audits than almost anybody else in the world, and she is now a partner at the Elections Group. We're going to finally hear from Matt Masterson, who is an election security expert, a former election official himself, was the election lead at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within DHS last year through the election, and now works for the Stanford Internet Observatory. And then finally, we're very fortunate to have Ben Ginsburg, a lawyer who has worked primarily on the Republican side, maybe exclusively on the Republican side, Ben, throughout his career, and is probably well known to many of you, available for questions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over first to Recorder Richer, who will outline some of the things he's seen.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, David. And thanks to David, Liz, Walker, and the Center for Election Innovation and Research for putting this on. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all one more time before the ninjas release their draft report. And so a little bit of context on who I am and what my office does. As David mentioned, I'm the Maricopa County Recorder. That is an elected position. I am a Republican. Ironically, I was elected this past November in the very election that we're talking about, in the very election that was purportedly stolen from Republicans. I unseated the chief elections official for the county, who was a Democrat. So now, together with the Board of Supervisors, a 5-person body, 4 of whom are Republicans, I am the co-director of the Elections Department. And the Elections Department is headed by 2 directors who are staff members, who's Ray Valenzuela, who's been a fixture in Arizona elections for a long time and is a real elections guru and expert, and Scott Jarrett, who's been a fantastic addition since 2019 and knows operations and how to get things done. They run the office in a competent, nonpartisan, transparent manner that I absolutely trust, and it has been my privilege to defend over these past few months. So I recently put out, last night I sent to many of you a report, a draft report that I'm going to put out later today, and it is a letter of sorts to the Republican Party, to my fellow Republicans, that I share your disappointment, I share your frustration. I'm not doing this because I'm anti-Republican. I have great conservative credentials. I have great Republican credentials, but we lost. And that's okay. It happens in elections. But what is not okay is to destroy democracy over one loss. So I lay out all the facts, I lay out the case, and I refer you to other sources as well in that report. If you would like a copy of that report, I'll put my email in the chat box, or I can share that with you in some manner, and I can get that to you. Now that joins 3 reports that have already been published that I want to make you aware of in case you're not already. One is from American Oversight, which was released yesterday, I believe. One is the report put together by Benny White and his teammates, Larry Moore and Tim Halverson. And one is the report that David mentioned from the States United for Democracy Center by Secretary Trey Grayson and Barry Burton. I believe there will also be a report coming from the Secretary of State, Katie Hobbs's office in the coming days. So real quickly about the cyber ninjas before I hand it over to Ray to talk about what Maricopa County did to ensure the validity of the 2020 election. And I would direct you all to a piece that Ben Ginsburg actually did for the Arizona Republic, which is, this is not about being anti-audit. I am not anti-audit. Our office is not anti-audit, but it can't be this audit. And Ben spells that out in eloquently and in detail in his article. And I try and capture some of that in some of my articles in my report too. And I realize it's a little rich to tell Jen Fifield and Jeremy Duda, who are on the line, about the sins of the cyber ninjas, because I've been getting it from them. But I'm going to real quickly repeat it here. And that's that if you want an audit, that's fine. But this isn't the audit you want. A reminder that the cyber ninjas had 0 election experience prior to coming to Arizona. 0. Okay, they had never run an election audit before. So if I incorporated an LLC tomorrow, it would have the exact same amount of experience that the cyber ninjas had upon coming to Arizona. It would seemingly also have the same head count and the same office space, which was just a PO box. This was partisan. It recruited almost entirely from the Republican Party. This was funded by the Stop the Steal movement. Our reporters have shown that 97% of the funding for this audit has come from the Stop the Steal movement. This is indulging conspiracy theories, which is why we're chasing bamboo fibers and UV lights. This is not transparent. If everyone remembers the cabin in the woods in Montana, hopefully, I think that's still going on. And this is led by a person who explicitly stated prior to conducting this election or this audit that the election was stolen. And we've seen how this manifests. And so I would encourage you to take everything that the cyber ninjas say with a grain of salt when they release their report, because we've already seen them walk back multiple claims. First, they talked about deleted files. Well, they accidentally, misplaced those, and then they found them. Whoops. Then there were the 74,000 ballots that were fraudulently injected into the system. Well, it took Garrett Archer of ABC 15 all of about 30 minutes to thoroughly debunk that in a manner that really any seasoned Arizona elections professional could have done probably in about the same amount of time, though Garrett did it very well. They resurrected the Sharpie Gate issue. And this was something that had been litigated and put to rest previously, but they brought it back. But then they said, oh, whoops, we actually haven't identified any overvotes caused by the Sharpie Gate issue. And so I would just say, they have the only thing that has been consistent about this endeavor has been missed deadlines and having to walk back statements. And so whatever they produce, I would not be surprised if they ultimately have to walk a lot of it back. So please please look into it before taking whatever the cyber ninjas produce as gospel. So now I'm going to turn it over to my fantastic colleague, Ray Valenzuela, to talk about some of the tests that Maricopa County ran both before the election and after the election to ensure the validity of Maricopa County's election in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you, Recorder Richard. First off, I want to acknowledge that we have an amazing assembly of election experts on this panel from all spectrums of the election process. And I'm honored to be in their company. And genuinely, if this panel cannot get you an answer, it's because an answer does not exist for the question, such as satellites beaming in votes. I don't know if we can answer that. But with that, I would like to state that as the LEO, or the local election official that oversees and conducts the election in Maricopa County with my co-director, that I see my role on this panel as sharing the election official perspective of someone who directly interacts with the conduct of the election itself. So for that, I would like to provide some foundational information as it relates to the process. And some of it is repeating what maybe has been stated already, but just to provide the context of post-election audit process here in Maricopa, which will lay some basis for what the other panelists may refer to when we further talk about the Senate audit. So as Recorder Richard eloquently stated, post-election audits are something that we welcome. And as a matter of fact, it's mandated in Arizona. So within our statutes, the statutes that are actually crafted by the very same legislative body that is conducting this current Senate audit, there are statutory requirements. And again, this mandate that requires that we do these certain things. We know post-election audits are designed to ensure accuracy of the election results, verify integrity, instill voter confidence, all of that. And the local officials, us as LEOs are well aware of that this process is necessary. And again, as Recorder Richard indicated, we're not against that. We actually are for that because it helps us, again, provide all of those mandates and features that ensure the integrity and the veracity of the election. So with that, and to that end, I want to provide the basis, and again, the core practices outlined in federal and Arizona state statute, so that, again, other panelists can segue from that and see what it is. The first and foremost is I'd like to talk about the tabulation process because that seems to be at the forefront of the audit. They did what we'll call the 100% hand count, as they call it. But before we get to that, the core practice is, and again, this is preaching to the choir, especially to this panel, but for the tabulation process, first and foremost, our equipment is certified, as is nationally, by the U.S. Election System Commission at a federal level, and even at Arizona has the Arizona Secretary of State Equipment Certification Advisory Committee. So that equipment is certified using the credentials, hash codes, checksums, all of this to say this system has been certified to be used. And the next part of that is then we put it into play. And part of that put it into play in Maricopa County. And I'm going to run through quickly some of the core elements of ahead of the hand count audit, which is first and foremost, our ballot tabulation center is a secure facility specifically designed that has restricted access. It's limited. It has badge access that logs everybody that goes in there. So establishing the fact that this tabulation center is a vault, and within that vault, we have a vault. I'll foremention that because part of the tabulation process, on top of utilizing restricted access, chain of custody, we have security, live 24/7 footage. Maricopa County uses, as is required, an air gap system in our tabulation room, meaning the ballot counting equipment is never connected to the internet. I mentioned that because there is some contention is, well, how do we know that? And I know the Recorder Richard mentioned and as did David, about the two independent VISLs or vote system test laboratories that we brought in to go above and beyond what is mandated in law to come in and have them do what we call the right way. And I know that sounds a little facetious, but if you're going to look to see if a machine connected to the internet, you don't need the routers. The routers give you everything that ever has happened in a county, but what you do is you start with the premise that the machine itself has logs. Those test laboratories, knowing what they know, and they are experts in the field, say we start with the transaction logs, the Windows system logs, we start with the event logs, and that's where we're looking to track, because it is tracked. Every tabulator in our system or our central count room is tracked, and those logs were looked at. And again, we can go down what they found, but I do want to point out that Maricopa County, as part of this process, has created a site dedicated, as requested by the recorder, justthefacts.vote. So for anybody that wants to, what we're saying here, you'll see the report, the two reports from these independent vote system test laboratories, where they checked the veracity of the system. They looked at the checksums. They looked at it was ever connected, looked at all those system logs. That's the way, the proper way to go and say, not check the electrical grid to see if it was ever plugged in, to go and see if the device, you check at the local direct level. So again, the premise and the core of this is that our tabulation center has many checks and balances to this process, but the core central security process itself relies on the combination of these verifications, combination of the chain of custody, a combination of participation by the political party. Even the tabulation process requires that there is a political party observer in there at all times when we're doing this concept. So we had the actual participation by the 3 recognized parties in Maricopa County, the Republican, Democrat, and Libertarian Party. We had those political appointees in the room during that observation. So I want to point that out as a core, but also quickly touch on the mandated audits. So in Arizona revised statute, pre and post logic accuracy tests are mandated, and further, a hand count audit is mandated. When I want to focus on the pre and post, most people, if they're not aware, is an independent test of before the election, after election, done by the Secretary of State, observed by the political parties, and even to some degree certified, signed off at the end to look at the results using test ballots to say, unknown to us, we are feeding in 8,000 ballots with known results. Did they come out the same? Review that, verify it. So that is a very critical test in Arizona that's mandated before and after election. But the big one that ties into the Senate audit is the mandated hand count. That was already done for 2020. We actually went through 3 hand counts. We did one in the 2020 election cycle for our presidential preference, our primary, and our general. But for the 2020 general specifically, we looked at 47,000, randomly the political parties, I want to point this out, they selected at random batches of ballots saying that one, that one, that one. I'm being a little bit facetious, but it's literally like that. It's without us being able to interject, and they sampled early ballots, a percentage of early ballots, a percentage of what is known as poll workers, but in polling places, for us, it's vote centers. They sampled those, and they provided the designated folks to actually do the audit. We facilitated in our tech area, but they actually provided 100% of the participants that were party individuals, bipartisan boards from the Dems, the Reps, and the Libs. And again, we looked at it over 47,000 vote positions. In doing that, they found 100% match to the tabulation equipment result. Again, this was not us that selected and say, look at these ballots. They randomly selected, and we use a significant sample to say, if anything was awry, you would see it in these different ballots. And again, bipartisan boards looked at 47,000 votes and found no errors. So the last thing I'd like to run through is our hand count procedure that's mandated, Arizona Revised Statute 16602, and the Elections Procedures Manual of Arizona. For the 2020, I can give you the exact page 222. If you start at that Election Procedures Manual, I'm going to run these down, and I'm going to do this so individuals here can take a mental comparison to what known to have happened at the Senate audit and what state law requires, mandates, doesn't allow us to deviate. This is strict compliance. This is how Maricopa County conducted it. First and foremost, the law requires it must be bipartisan boards conduct a hand count. Each hand count must be comprised of designees from at least 2 recognized political parties, and no more than 75% of the members may be from the same political party. That's a mandate. Again, compare this to what is known to what occurred at the Senate audit. In addition, hand count board members must be registered to vote in Arizona for checks and balances to verify they are registered voters. Candidates appearing on the ballot, except for the Office of Precinct Committeeman, may not serve on the hand count board. Again, I am reading verbatim from the procedures manual. Hand count shall not proceed unless a sufficient number of bipartisan hand count board members have been designated. Otherwise, the results of the audit done by unbalanced party boards could not be trusted or considered valid. It's in law that you do not proceed if you do not have sufficient number of bipartisan hand count boards. Board members may not bring any electronic devices, black pens, blue pens, or cell phones into the designated area. I mention that because there was an issue with the black and blue pens. This is in law and has been in law since the hand count statutes were in place and built by the Senate legislative and the state legislative body. So these rules are not, these came straight out of statute and in the procedures manual. Next, recording of the hand count is allowed. And the sole act, and this is the exact word, sole act of reporting the hand count does not constitute grounds for the officer in charge of elections to prohibit observers from recording or to remove them from the facility. This is straight out of the procedures manual. Transparency is key in a hand count audit. It must, for the statute, include 5 contests: a statewide proposition, legislative, federal, and a presidential when that appears. So it mandates that. Those are the contests to look to have a fair and balanced, to look at the state level, the federal level, the proposition, and so on. There are 2 approved methods in statute, and only 2. One is what is referred to as the stacking method that is mandated to be used for all hand count optical digital scan ballots. Then there is outlined in there, which is no longer used because Arizona doesn't have this VVPAT is what it's called. The 3-person call-out method, which is what the Senate used, can only, and it mandates, can only be used when you're hand counting accessible voting machine, paper, audit trail tapes, because those are a continuous roll, so you can't stack to. But they mandate if you are going to do the paper ballots, you do a stack to, which basically means that 3-member boards, bipartisan, are independently reviewing a batch of ballots. That judge, the 2 judges, as an example, a Dem and a Rep, would take that batch, say there, and do independent count, say I have 185, hand it over to the next without telling that. And that judge says I have 195, stop. We have the same ballots in front of us, there's something wrong. The core element of this is you do not proceed until you have balance. If it's not matching, you go no further. This is not an end of process cumulative total. Let's see if we balance. This is a right here, right now, stop and make sure we balance. So again, that is prescribed for. So the key things to take away are they must be bipartisan boards, cannot be more than 75% of the same party, and cannot have candidates on the board, red pens only, and you must use mandatory the stack to method for paper ballots, not a call out, because call out is prone to be filled with human error when you're doing a tally, but it's necessary when it's a VVPAT or a roll because you can't stack to. So I wanted to point those out. And again, also as stated, Maricopa County Board of Supervisors and the recorder, part overseeing the election department, went above and beyond to substantiate and verify the tabulation, not only by using these prescribed for, but the aforementioned 2 additional independent audits that, again, we can talk a little bit more, but that is in our Just the Facts.vote page. You can see those reports from Pro-BMV and SLI compliance. Again, 2 vote system test laboratories accredited and certified company. So to close, I just wanted to let folks know that the audit rules, we believe in audits. We conduct them as mandatory, and those rules were established by the state legislature, and those are exactly the rules that Maricopa County and all other counties followed to confirm, verify, and certify the results of the 2020 election. So those are just the facts, and hopefully that folks can use this then as a basis when they speak to the further information on this audit.
Thanks so much, Ray. I just want to elaborate on something Ray said. You just heard really a complex network of protections and checks and balances that a county like Maricopa County has in place. And that is to protect things like chain of custody and the provenance of evidence that might be used. And you heard about secure rooms and vaults and detailed logs and things along those lines. And you'll recall that the Department of Justice wrote a letter to the Arizona Senate several months ago, pointing out that the effort that likely destroyed the chain of custody was likely in violation of federal law that requires retention and specifically protection of the chain of custody over time. That's very important because ultimately you might need to use these records as evidence in some kind of judicial proceeding. And when someone like the Cyber Ninjas has done what they have done, even if they were to have found a problem, which of course we know this was set up that they couldn't have found any real problems, even if they existed, which they appear not to have at all. But even if they were to have found a problem, they likely have so destroyed the chain of custody and provenance of the evidence that it would be very likely that that evidence would be excluded in any kind of judicial proceeding. And so it was really important that counties like Maricopa established these kinds of procedures as they had, and it's unfortunate to see a third party who was inexperienced destroy them as they have. With that, I want to hand it over to Benny White, who I've gotten to know recently. I'll let him describe how he got into this work, but he's done some absolutely crucial work along with his partners on this to look into the results in Arizona and see what he could find and confirm whether or not they were accurate. So with that, I'm going to hand that over to you, Benny.
Thank you very much, David. And I really appreciate all the media attention to what we're saying here. This is an extremely important forum to counter the disinformation campaign that is going on with the Steal to Vote effort. I posted my personal email in the chat, and I'd like to also alert everyone that you're going to be inundated with details here. And I'm going to try to keep this up at the 30,000 or higher level because I know that a lot of this information is new to everyone. But we do have a website, real-audits.org. I encourage everyone to go there, download our 30-page report, if you will. Take a look at it. And if you have any questions, my team and I are welcome any inquiries or the chance to get together with you and describe what we've done. But with that, I have to say that I could not have done anything that I've done without the help of Larry Moore and Tim Halverson. Larry is a former CEO of Clear Ballot. He's developed the vote visualization system that is used in Clear Ballot. And Tim was the guy that wrote the software for all that stuff. They've taken election systems through the certification process, so they know how these systems work. I've been involved in Republican politics for about 25 years. And for the last 14 years, I've been involved in election law and election administration in Arizona from A to Z. I've been involved in all of it. I wrote a lot of those procedures that Ray just described in the elections procedures manual. So I'm hoping that I can convince you that I know what I'm talking about. People ask me, why are you doing this? I'm in disfavor in the Republican Party by even questioning the fact that Trump lost the election because of fraud. And I am very, very concerned about my country. We are in a period of increasing civil turmoil, and distrust in our elections exacerbates that problem. And so that's why I am involved. We cannot enter into an era where every election is contested months, years after the fact. You can come in 6 months or a year after the election. If you have a big enough checkbook, you can write a check and have the election results overturned. We simply can't do that as a country. There's a period for recounts. There's a period for contests. Get your act together, file the lawsuits, win or lose, and then move on. So that's why I'm involved. I want to talk a little bit about what we were trying to do. First off, we wanted to verify that the election results in the state and in Maricopa County specifically were accurate. Also wanted to inform the public, lawyers, judges, other jurisdictions, that there were adequate public records available to everyone that they could use to verify their election results without going through the circus that we've seen in Phoenix and all of the misinformation and disinformation that has occurred because of that. Eventually, once we got all the public records and took a look at them, we tried to help Karen Fann conduct an actual recount of the election. What they're doing is called an audit, but it's not really. It's an organized disinformation campaign. And I'm hoping that's what everyone will take away from this. It's easy to get lost in the details and the numbers and the regulations and the statutes, but we need to ask, why did this happen? And this started happening in November. The local media here asked for disclosure of public records from the Senate, found that Karen Fann and others had had about 500 communications between the Trump team and the lawyers, and that started us down this slippery slope to where we find ourselves today. Finally, we want to hold the Arizona Senate and Karen Fann accountable. We tried twice to assist Karen Fann by providing vote counts and ballot counts for the batches in the boxes that the ninjas were looking at. She refused to let us help her. Eventually, then Ken Bennett, her liaison, came to us. He said, look, here's 20 boxes that I have counts on. Can you tell me what you think the counts are in those boxes? We looked at them. 16 of them were right on. 4 of them had minor errors. 1 of them had a fairly significant error of 18 ballots. And if you don't have the ballot count right, there's no way that the vote count is going to be correct. So now we have a public records request asking for all the vote counts, all the ballot counts produced by the ninjas and by the Senate in their machine count. And we'll go through any report that they put out line by line by line and point out where they're wrong, because they're going to claim that their results are different from the official results. And we're going to say, well, that's because you're wrong. You went about it incorrectly. You produced incorrect results, and you've delayed and confused the public, and that's just not appropriate. We found through our analysis that Donald Trump lost the election because a lot of voters who voted for down ballot Republicans didn't vote for Donald Trump. As a matter of fact, about 60% of them, when they did that, voted for Joe Biden. The total overall result in the state was about a 10,000 vote loss. In Maricopa County, Donald Trump lost by about 45,000 votes. In Pima County, where I live, he lost by about 98,000 votes. Those are significant losses that were not able to be offset by the strong Trump report or support in the other 13 counties. So with that, I think I'm going to close, and hopefully we can get to some good questions and be able to answer those for you. But again, I'd like to ask you to go to my website, download that report. If you have questions, email me.
Thank you so much, Benny. And I want to encourage everyone to go and look at the report as well. One of the points that Benny just made, I think is really important here, is that Benny and his team were able to do all of this for months. And that's similar, for instance, to the situation in many other states where information efforts are utilizing subpoenas and other efforts to confirm results that have already been confirmed in a transparent manner, consistent with state law. Often, in almost every case, those states' laws were passed by Republican legislatures. And yet they're subpoenaing documents that are unnecessary and can't lead to any actual information, because the information that's necessary to confirm the results was already transparently and publicly reported out. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to a real expert on audits and someone who has actually observed a lot of the things in Arizona firsthand, who's Jennifer Morell, who has also worked with Secretary of State Hobbs. So Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, David. Really great to be here. Appreciate your opening remarks and all the comments that have been made so far. I'm going to keep my thoughts fairly brief. I've already spoken and written on what's been happening in Arizona extensively, but there are 2 points that I'll just emphasize that you've heard already. Both this effort in Arizona, the efforts that we're seeing in other states to relitigate the November election, we need to not call that an audit. This is an unofficial election review, a partisan review, whatever term you want to use, but it's not an audit. And I think that's really important. As you heard from Ray, election audits are defined in statute. Those processes and policies and procedures are described, they're documented, they're conducted by election officials using best practices. They have a statutory start date and a statutory ending date when that audit needs to be completed. They're done in a way that is made observable to the media, to the public. They produce reports, they have independent boards. So all of these things that we come to think of as an election audit are not the things that I saw or that we have continued to see happening with this unofficial review in Arizona of the Maricopa County election. So I guess that kind of leads to the second point that I think as you're thinking about like whatever comes out of this report and how you're going to define that and report on that, any audit, so whether we're talking about an election audit or a financial audit or some other audit being conducted, it's critical for the integrity of that audit to be systematic, to have a documented process when we're both obtaining that evidence and we're evaluating that evidence. What I saw as an observer for the secretary, as I've stated before, was a continual shifting of policies and procedures, starting with none. We had to get a court order in order to get some initial documentation. Those processes changed day to day, week to week, sometimes mid-shift. We saw a real lack in security controls, chain of custody, lack, unlike what we would see, what I have seen in my 13 years working in elections, running elections, working with election professionals like Ray and Stephen and others, where there is real control over those ballots, meaning we have documented piece counts. We know exactly where they'll be staged and sealed and controlled. We didn't see any of that in Arizona. I think the other thing too that's problematic, we had that portion of this activity that resembled a hand count. We also had this other portion of the activity where ballots were imaged and flagged for inconsistencies. Keep in mind that those ballots were imaged using unnamed software that we don't know anything about, that's untested, uncertified, unlike all of the voting equipment that we use in conducting our elections. We saw the requirements for what was deemed an anomalous ballot. We saw those shifting. Again, we certainly saw the procedures around that activity changing from the time that this exercise or this unofficial election review began all the way through the time that it wrapped up. So I think those are my sort of two things that I'm happy to take more questions on. This is not an audit. This doesn't resemble best practices, nor does it resemble what is already documented and required under state statute for election officials in Arizona to do. And whatever comes out of this report, there's been a lack of consistency throughout the entire process that I think would make whatever they have to say lacking in any sort of integrity or anything that we would want to report on or find credible. So.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's great. I think that's exactly right. And again, I hearken people back to the National Association of Secretary of State task force that just released their recommendations and how they talked about transparency and chain of custody and other standards that are absolutely essential to transparently demonstrate to all voters, including those who supported the losing candidate, that the results of the election were correct. Election officials do that. The cyber ninjas didn't. So with that, I'm going to hand it off now to Matt Masterson, who's going to make the final comments, and then we'll take questions.
Thanks, David. Appreciate you all hosting this. I'll be extraordinarily brief because I know members of the media at this point are itching to get to questions, and just start with a brief thank you to the local media there in Arizona who have done incredible work, and some national reporters being on site, digging into the details, talking to election professionals to report on this story over months. Just so appreciated the level of work and effort and collaboration that's gone into this. Briefly, as everyone's said, to kind of just sum up, that there's three pillars that go into elections in any state, whether we're talking Arizona, Georgia, Florida, my home state of Ohio, Oregon, that apply across the board. Policies, procedures, state laws differ, but every state offers a transparent process. The modes of transparency may vary, but every state offers transparency around elections. Second, they offer bipartisan or multi-partisan engagement. As you heard Ray describe, you have Ds and Rs participating, watching, engaged in each step of the process, including audits after the election. And then finally, it involves election professionals. Folks like Ray Valenzuela across this country don't wake up the day before an election starts and decide that it's time to go run that election. They spend every day, every hour focused on how to improve the process, what could go wrong, how do we prepare for those contingencies in order to run a process that's secure, that has integrity and is accurate, and can be demonstrated as such to voters. And that's in stark contrast, as we've heard, from what we've seen the ninjas perform, a sentence I never thought I'd utter in elections. The ninjas offered little to no transparency without having their hand forced by a court. And even then, it was far short of the standard that we have in elections. Bipartisanship was at no point in play for them. Recruiting a set of workers we know from the good reporting down there that offer no balance to the process or really even vetting like election officials do, and certainly no professional either election administration approaches or even auditing approaches, as Jennifer's highlighted. And so this activity fulfills none of the core competencies and expectations that those of us who have worked in elections for our entire careers not only expect, but push each other to live up to across all 50 states and 8,800 jurisdictions. So to be clear, that this process isn't an audit or a review, but instead a grift, as David said. This is an effort and a playbook that unfortunately we will see again because it has proven to be effective both in the messaging and in the fundraising around it, as we've seen with the excellent reporting around $5 million+ raised in this. And so this is a dis and misinformation playbook intended to accomplish two things. One, undermine confidence in our democracy, force election officials and those of us on this call to play whack-a-mole around claims and conspiracies ranging from bamboo ballots to Italian satellites to questions around the 74,000 ballots that then they roll back days later, but the damage is done, and they know that. They know that that's the end result of this. And so I ask, as you look to cover this, as you cover, this activity and the release of this report, understand how far short this activity has fallen from the expectations of both professional election officials and auditors. Understand that the playbook is now in place and is being used across the United States. We see Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan suffering the same sort of efforts in a misguided attempt to grift off of our democracy, and encourage you to hold those pushing that grift accountable for their activities in the same way we as election professionals would expect you to hold us accountable for our policies, procedures, and results. And I'll end with this. I sat in the operations center at DHS on election day. In the lead up to election day, on election day, and afterwards, we were in constant contact with thousands of state and local election officials looking for disruptions, whether cyber, physical, or otherwise. We worked with the DOJ, FBI, state and local officials to look for, pervasive fraud. And across the board, DHS, FBI, DOJ, in public statements and reports, they've reaffirmed the accuracy, security, and integrity of this election, with Bill Barr himself offering the statement that there's no evidence of any security breaches or fraud that would call into question the accuracy or results of this election. So that, from my federal perspective and the years worth of work that we did across this community, in the end, this was as quiet a presidential election as I've ever experienced. And it's a direct result of the incredible work of the state and local election officials that ran this election. So thank you, and I appreciate the time.
Thanks so much, Matt. I promised you there wouldn't be a presentation from Ben Ginsburg, but you're going to be subjected to one now. But Ben, I know you had some thoughts on kind of how this report might be processed and presented, and I wanted you to share those a little bit.
Well, thank you, David. I'd be happy to, and nice to be with all of you, and congratulations and thanks for putting on this forum. So, David, I think the answer to that I would base on having spent the better part of 4 decades doing recounts, contests, post-election activities, as well as election day operations looking for fraud. So it's important to see what the evidence is, but that time also provides some insights on the two sides fighting each other over situations like this. I think one thing to absolutely look for is to see what the Trump administration did with the Mueller report. And by that, I mean, there was an effort to cast the report, the public perceptions of the report before the report itself was actually presented. And of course, once the report itself actually came out, it was much different from the early characterizations. So I would be very careful as a reporter in looking for wild allegations or general allegations or comments without the backup being out. So this whole audit is a chance for the Trump forces to actually prove the case they've been trying to make, that the elections are fraudulent. They can't possibly have a more ideal set of circumstances to do that, because it's not a real audit, as Jen Morrell said. It is something designed to their specifications. So the real thing is to make sure that they provide the proof, the evidence, as they have it. Proof may be too strong a word, but the evidence that they have for any broad allegations that are made. Garrett Archer had a question in the Q&A about the types of things they might allege. I think it is not possible at this point to make the allegation that any of that is sufficient to overturn the results of the election. And so if you're Karen Fann in the Senate, you have to take that information and try and cast it forward for legislation in the future. Of course, what's so important about this forum for the Trump forces to make their case is that over the past 8 months, they haven't had to prove a case. And every time they've tried to prove a case, it has not worked out. So this is a big show for the Trump forces. And if they don't produce here in Arizona, first of all, we'll stop audits in other states, I think, from going forward, because it's a real object lesson on what to do or not do. But the Trump forces, if you put it all together, have got problems. They lost all 60 court cases, including about 8 in Arizona. There was recently a Michigan Senate report by Senate Republicans that rebuffed completely the Trump theories about Michigan. In Georgia, there was a report by Matt Brainerd, who is one of the people the Trump forces turned to make allegations about illegal votes. I would commend all of you to take a look at the Hoover Institution Stanford website for an article by Justin Grimmer, Andy Hall, and Michael Thompson of UCLA about how the Brainerd report and its methodology does not at all hold up. So it's likely in Arizona you'll see some allegations about illegal voters with that similar methodology that was used in Georgia, and this is a refutation of that. This also comes after the Mike Lindell show last weekend in South Dakota, which, again, a lot of spectacular allegations without the proof to be able to back it up. The reports about the Attorney General Barr and Jeffrey Rosen not finding evidence of fraud, and the comments from Trump and his others. It comes after Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, spent 22,000 hours trying to find fraud and couldn't. The Heritage Foundation database, which has been at the core of many of the allegations over the years, is really an embarrassment to Heritage. The motions to dismiss the case made by Giuliani, Powell, and Byrne failed over the past couple of weeks. And it goes on, including now the process moving to court sanctions against lawyers in Colorado, Rudy Giuliani losing his bar license, and a hearing in Michigan. So, David, I think that all of this, but especially Arizona, is really an inflection point for the audits in other states and why the flaws that have gone into the Arizona audit, the procedural problems that have been described here are really, really important to come out in the context once the report itself comes out.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Ben, so much for that. And you referenced Garrett Archer's question, and Jen Fifield also asked a similar question. I think it's kind of a good place to start. And I first want to start that many have said this. The reason we know so much about what's going on with this partisan effort by the cyber ninjas in Arizona is thanks largely due to the incredibly tireless and intrepid work of local reporters on the ground in Arizona. I have not personally been in Arizona during these past few months. Jennifer obviously has, and obviously the people who work in Arizona have, but they have been reporting on this so diligently, and I am incredibly grateful for this effort. I cannot imagine where we would be but for that. But I think the question, if I can summarize the main question here is, we're likely to see the cyber ninjas attempt to leverage and make more out of extremely minor alleged problems, many of which are probably not true anyway, to try to make it seem as if we shouldn't trust elections. And this goes to one of Jennifer's points. This is not an audit. This is not anything designed to get at any actual effort to understand what happened. It is entirely appropriate when you have a presidential election, which is a time when 160 million Americans do something they don't do very often in a process run by millions of volunteers. It is not going to be perfect by any means, but that is why election officials have built this incredibly sophisticated network of checks and balances into the system over time. And this is why we know the election was as secure as it was. Arizona has its most secure and accurate voter rolls in its history right now, because it's been a member of the Electronic Registration Information Center and compares its list with other states. It has a lot of mail voting, which is a great way of getting feedback about addresses. I can tell you, I've been working on voter lists for a long time. Arizona's voter lists have never been more accurate. They have paper, they have audits, they have everything you want from an election system. And it's a testament to the Republicans and Democrats in that state who've worked so hard to build it to this point. Now, in every single state, are there things we could do to improve slightly over time if we really wanted to look at processes? Yeah, there's small tweaks here or there that could be made to improve access and integrity. But overall, there is no question that the outcome in Arizona was accurate. And that, as Benny pointed out, the analysis of the ballots is pretty conclusive that then President Trump was actually a drag on the rest of the Republican ballot, that the Republicans did well. I mean, I'll put it in a national context. Republicans won, I believe, every single or maybe all but one toss-up race in the U.S. House nationally. They held Senate seats that were thought to be at risk. In places like North Carolina, for instance. They won by the largest margins they had seen in states like Florida and Ohio. So the results of the elections actually nationally were pretty darn good for Republicans. It was really just at the top of the ticket where people expressed their preference otherwise. And that has been verified over and over and over again. I think it's really difficult to play whack-a-mole here, as Matt mentioned. I think it's, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this. I think what the election deniers want is for those who are supporting the integrity of the election and trying to build voter confidence to try to refute every single whack-a-mole proposition. And the fact is that this election is so secure and verified and transparent over time that it's incumbent upon them to come up with evidence, as Ben pointed out, that the outcome was wrong. And over 80 federal judges have heard this, many of them Trump-appointed judges. There are now Trump-appointed judges who are considering sanction motions against Giuliani and Powell and indicating that they are very likely to institute sanctions against them for bringing frivolous lawsuits. So I think the proper measure is, have the cyber ninjas met any burden of proving that the election wasn't secure and verified and transparent? And the answer is going to be very clearly no, they haven't come close to meeting that burden. Does anyone else have any thoughts on the overall questions that Jennifer and Garrett brought up. All right.
David, I guess there's a question pending here about what do we think is the greatest danger? To me, it's the fact that this type of untrust of our elections and of our election officials adds to the potential for civil unrest. And to me, that's the largest danger.
Yeah, it's not even hypothetical, is it? I mean, we're literally seeing a bomb threat at the Capitol today. It is an ongoing thing. I haven't looked at Twitter recently, but I believe it is still an ongoing issue. Election officials at the National Association of Secretaries of State meeting reported out, there's a really good NPR piece by Miles Parks on it that came out yesterday, reported they are still seeing death threats to this day. I spoke personally to many election officials who are having to take unprecedented security measures to protect themselves and their families in the face of these threats. And we're in August of an odd numbered year. Jen, Matt, Ray, you've all been long-time election officials at periods of time. It is frankly unprecedented that we are talking about these issues now in an odd numbered year, 10 months after the election. This is the time usually that we would be just simply planning for the next election. We'd be taking stock of what we could improve upon and maybe catching a little rest, especially for the election officials who've been working tirelessly on this. And instead, we are relitigating an election that has been verified by every single court, by Republicans, by Democrats, by every process with more audits than ever before and more paper. And we are still seeing these highly dangerous circumstances play themselves out today. Stephen, did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just going to say vacation. Yeah, is what he should have been doing. But
David?
Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, so I think that's actually a really important impact that we need to be talking more about, is that these election officials, not only is it an odd year, but they have already moved on. They're running other elections. They're preparing for next year. And yet the drain on their time and on their resources to having to continually answer questions about these crazy conspiracy theories is real. They're losing staff. That is real. It's sucking a lot of time and energy. That is real. I think to Jen's question about the whack-a-mole approach, I'm not sure it's worth chasing down all of these allegations when we know for a fact this activity lacked quality controls. We didn't have on each of these individual activities, the ballot review and marking of votes on the two particular contests that they were looking at. We know that throughout that process, all the way through recording what was on those tally sheets, we lacked any sort of quality control. So I feel like just on its face, there's no merit to whatever conclusions come from that. We know, as I mentioned, on the imaging of the ballots and this forensic, quote unquote, examination of those, there's no merit to that. I don't know that it's worth chasing down, whatever conclusions are drawn. Same with this examination, as Stephen mentioned, of data that was sent to Montana that is unknown where that went, what was looked at, what was done. I just don't know that there's a benefit to just to Jeremy's question, that's important to keep in mind when we do an official audit. It's pretty black and white. We draw a sample of ballots, we record information from those, and we compare that to the voting system, whether we're comparing that to cast vote records or batch subtotals reports. We're making a comparison, and either there are discrepancies or there are not. To escalating that audit if there are discrepancies, and that's all made public. That's all in those public reports that are put out. I mean, we have states, for instance, like New Mexico, that actually bring in an external auditor to review that just for an added layer of independence. So I think, again, nothing that's been done with this activity mirrors that. Just black and white, here's what we looked at, here's what we found, here are the issues. It's just so mired in problems that I don't know. I want to move on.
David?
Yeah, Ben.
I'm sympathetic to reporters, being a former reporter, of having to chase down a lot of the sort of spectacular allegations that will come here. I only say that the ninjas have run into problems in the devil of the details on this, whether it's the 74,000 absentee ballots or the databases they couldn't find. So I hope that all of you, as you go after the individual charges, will actually demand that they produce evidence to back them up, because I think that's where they're going to fail. And again, the Hoover-Stanford study is the perfect example of the methodology of taking apart sort of a constant allegation that the Trump forces have made around the country.
That's a great point, Ben. And I'm so glad you mentioned that Hoover Institution study. I included a link in the chat. I hope everyone will go to that. It is, there were these frivolous and dangerous allegations made in Georgia by people who don't truly understand how elections are run there. And they purported to show that there was potentially rampant fraud. And this was reviewed by the well-known communists at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, who have extensive experience with elections and social science research, led by Justin Grimmer. And I think the summary of their conclusions were that the analysis that was produced in Georgia was, quote, deeply flawed, unquote. And I think they were probably being somewhat generous even there.
And David, it was specifically about illegal voters,
Right.
Either not on the rolls or had moved out of state and weren't really residents of Georgia anymore. And it went through the methodologies of why the methodologies to make the allegations turned out to be completely baseless. And so that actually will have transferability, I would kind of guess, to the Arizona.
Yeah.
situation.